So I'm going to just give a very quick intro and then I'll introduce our panelists. Today I'm joined by Olivia McGregor, Net Zero with Nature Programme Manager at the New Forest National Park Authority, joined by Paul Nolan, Director at Mersey Forest, and Ed Shuldham, Business Development Manager at Stratham Farms, which is part of the Environmental Farmers Group, who are going to share their experience of working with farmers so far. So just a reminder of the toolkit and where we are, and I don't know if we can have the next slide, please, Blanche. So as you know, the toolkit launched in December, and there are these, I had to count them then, 8 milestones that we've identified through to Investment Readiness, and obviously you can play around with the toolkit, and I know many of you have fed back in or offered feedback on the toolkit and the milestones so far, and the considerations and the case studies many of you have offered to share in collaborating and offering yourselves up to be case studies, and some of that feedback has already been plugged back in, and we're aiming for about 2 to 4 really sort of four case studies to go up a month, so we keep populating with new information, also constantly updating some of those considerations for you and some of the sort of technical tweaks that we can make to make the toolkit easier for you. So thank you to those who have been feeding back, and we are still taking feedback, and Phoebe's email will be up at the end where you can contact her about it. But today we're going to be focused on milestone 2. So by now you'll have done some initial project scoping, and this particular lunch and learn session is going to be looking at how you identify and work with sellers. And then next time we'll be looking at baselining and estimating ecosystem services. So I think with that, we'll start with our wonderful panel, because we want to leave as much time for Q&A as possible. The chat function does work today, which is great. There's also a Q&A, and if you're struggling with that, we can also you can raise a hand at the end. What we're going to do is have a brief presentation from each of the panelists. I'm going to ask them a few questions, and then that will take probably us through to the past, and then we'll have as much of that next half hour from questions from you. But don't let that stop you from typing them in the chat, because I will keep an eye on that, and we can always weave them in as we go. So with that, I think we'll drop these slides and then hand it over to you, Olivia. Thank you so much for joining us. Please, would love if you could share with the group a little bit of brief background on your project.
Yeah, thank you very much, Helen. Hi, everyone. I'm the Net Zero with Nature Programme Manager at the New Forest National Park. We have been working with Palladium under the Revere model, which is essentially working on national parks. Government have asked national parks to do more for nature recovery and climate mitigation, and we were sponsored by the NERF project in round 1 to investigate the potential for private finance to help with these, meet these aims. National parks have been underfunded historically, and also the nature and climate emergency mean that more has to be done to keep our national park healthy in the sort of face of climate change. And so this project enabled us to sort of see what the private finance opportunities were. So just going to share a couple of slides. So share screen. So I've just got just a map where you can see where the New Forest National Park is. This is to show that the national park is surrounded by Bournemouth and Southampton, big areas where lots of new development is happening. So things like biodiversity net gain, and then we've got also nitrate neutrality is a requirement in the New Forest as well. You can see all of that orange, the areas in orange there. So we were aware that biodiversity net gain and nitrate neutrality would be 2 options for our landowners to derive an income from. And then there's also woodland carbon code as well. So we took the approach of, engaging with 3 landowners. One was Forestry England, who own 50% of the park. They're a public sector owner. and then 2 landowners, private, who are in the southeast corner of the national park, so you can see on this map. And they were sited in areas of high development. So we felt they had a good opportunity for exploring the potential there. And the opportunity we took was, that's just a bigger map of more detail of where the landowners were, which I can go into more detail later on. And this is a summary of the approach we took with landowners. So first of all, actually looked at the state of nature on their land currently. Then we looked at the opportunity for restoration on that land, going through both a scenario where they wouldn't have to predominantly change what they were doing, and then what we called a data enhanced scenario, where we looked at what were the opportunities if they sort of turned all of their land over to nature restoration, followed on by an economic model. And that was so that they could compare the income streams from nature restoration with what they're currently doing, and really enabling them to make a sort of really business-based decision on the sort of nature restoration opportunities in their area. And that was this is a slide from Palladium, who we subcontracted to do this work. And then following on from that, the implementation is up to the landowner to decide, from a business point of view, what makes sense for them. Obviously we engaged with 3 landowners during this NERF funded project, but we have many more. And so a key aim for us is to really engage our entire community. So we did some work on an event to bring all the landowners together, and we put a web resource together to make our landowning community aware of the opportunity and the sort of the lessons that we learned from going through this really interesting and sort of complex project. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Olivia. So I guess a question I have is, how did you select the 3 landowners, the main landowners that you worked with initially? So you mentioned Forestry England and then the 2 private landowners.
Sorry, Helen, I'm just trying to stop sharing. Have I managed to do that?
I can still see your slide. There you go.
There we go. Yeah, sorry. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, no worries. I was just wondering, so you mentioned you worked with, in terms of like your sellers, your landowners would be Forestry England that you worked with, and then 2 private landowners. How did you select those 3? So why did you select those 3?
Yeah, so we selected Forestry England because they own 50% of the national park, so we felt that they were a really important stakeholder. And then we selected the other 2 because they were in an area of high development pressure, and we felt could take advantage of the private income streams available. The 2 estates, private estates, were quite near each other, as well as was the portion of land we looked at with Forestry England. So we felt there was also opportunities to map ecological sort of networks there and see how we could use these 3 estates to kind of create bigger, better, more joined up habitats. So it was from that kind of angle that we engaged with those 3. And
did you sort of go to them with the idea at first, or did you already sort of map out what the opportunities might be commercially for them before you approached them?
A bit of both. We had a sort of sense of the geography, thinking that would be these would be good estates to engage with. But obviously, we went and spoke to them to see if they were interested in participating, and gave them a sense of what we wanted to do on the project as well, and kind of what they would get out of it. And we were pleased that they were willing to be involved.
And what was it that they were particularly looking for?
Well, I think they, with all the uncertainty around the sort of subsidies for farming, they are also looking around about how they can derive an income from their estate. So it felt like a good opportunity, and a good opportunity for them to explore as well. So yeah, it felt like a sort of mutually beneficial exercise.
I know, I'm sure there'll be questions related about what kind of information you showed them, but just finally, because I think this is a really important point before we move on to Paul, is that that it wasn't as easy working with the public sector with Forestry England as maybe you'd hoped, and there are sort of policy challenges around that. I don't know if you want to just share that briefly.
Yeah, so the Forestry England piece of land is in a triple SI, and because they have a legal obligation to keep up that triple SI status, they get funding already for nature restoration in that area, and so are not able to take advantage of biodiversity net gain income stream. So that was a big sort of limitation of working on that specific piece of land for Forestry England that we wouldn't have known about before we undertook the project.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I know that we have lots of questions, so I want to leave plenty of time for that. So coming to you now, Paul, thanks for joining us today. And I know you're going to give a short presentation on the work that you've been doing, and we'll ask a couple of questions before we move on to Ed.
Find it. So yeah, thanks very much. So my name is Paul Nolan, and I'm director at Mersey Forest, based up in Merseyside and Cheshire. And our NERF project was to look at doubling nature investment in a place called the Woodland Valley. So we wanted to identify the market suppliers of natural capital, develop a business case to take that work forward, investigate the use of a special purpose vehicle as a way to potentially capture some of the benefits and agglomerate some of the land holdings as well, and then using the Woodland Valley in Cheshire East as an initial focus. Woodland Valley is just south of Manchester. We also worked in the wider Mersey Forest for examples and opportunities too, and worked with both public and private sector landowners throughout the project. We did a baseline for the area with this idea of the vision of doubling nature. We needed to make sure that we were pointing people in the right direction and identifying the right places. So we did some mapping of the area and also identified landowners, particularly those who owned more significant parcels of land across the geography as well. And the mapping showed there was more than enough scope to double nature if the resources could be found to do it. And then we worked in detail with one estate in the Woodland Valley on the scheme, 40.85 hectare scheme, which we were hoping to have got over the line this year with some potentially voluntary BNG and carbon. That scheme's now been delayed. We're hoping it will come into the programme next season. I'm going to talk about that particular landowner. And then the second one was something which we found really interesting, was working with a public sector organisation, and they had a potential disposal of around 260 hectares of their own land. We persuaded them to look at a soft market test for investment from a wider range of potentially investors who might create woodland and a mix of other habitats, again using carbon and BNG. And that soft market test took place and showed there was a wide range of interested organisations, or certainly a range of organisations, all using carbon, as well as some grant support that we have available within Mersey Forest. And the authority is looking to move to a full marketing of these sites, so again that will run beyond the NERF programme. In terms of lessons, in our case, many of the landowners want investment but did not want to give up control, which is interesting. So for many, the buyer option was maybe preferred, and many being advised to sit tight and wait and see what happens. So how we actually persuade landowners to make decisions when there's such turbulence in the markets is a challenge. On the public side of things, there is increasing interest, I think, in releasing capital from land holdings, but that has to be at market value or close to it. And we'll probably touch on net zero, BNG, etc. later on, but and how that's driving or not driving landowner decisions. And in terms of investors, some of our discussion with investors indicated that they want a packaged product, they want scale, and they also, for some of them, they don't know us very well as a sector, and so that for some of them that builds an additional risk for their investment, and they charge a premium for that. So just being aware of, for us, being aware of those sorts of issues. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Paul. It's really great. So you typically work with large landowners. Is that the case?
A real mix, actually. So
Okay. And I just wondered what the sort of the differences you see, and I'm sure some are sort of obvious to us, but between what large landowners are open to doing and what small landowners might be open to doing.
I think there's enthusiasm from all sides, and I think there's often it's the individuals rather than the land size that makes the difference. And they've got examples of not in the NERF program, but people making positive environmental choices who own quite small parcels of land actually. And but then I think certainly in our area, certainly in Cheshire, all of the estates are moving towards natural capital thinking, if not doing, and they've all got plans in place to take to move their estates forward in a positive environmental way.
Mm-hmm. And did you mention there that one of the landowners you've been working with was a local authority?
Yeah.
And are there any sort of nuances to working with local authorities that you?
So obviously there's the other thing about landowners is what we found was that certainly in the private sector, our scheme might be one of several they're considering. So yeah, actually we won't be the only thing that they're thinking of. So just be aware that can mean that the scheme drops out at some point. And public sector, there's obviously the time scales often for getting things through governance in particular, which is important, but that can need to play into a plan for how you're going to engage with the authorities, and also obviously needing to be really prudent about what they do, where they do it, and how they do it.
And in terms of were there any policy issues that arose for you or have arisen for you as you've been working with landowners?
I think for us, one of the keys was, and this is starting to be resolved, but how the carbon code will evolve in particular. So there's obviously some questions about that, and also the stacking and bundling discussion was really live whilst we were going through this process as well. And I think having clarity around that, which is hopefully coming, would be really helpful for landowners, I think.
And I know you mentioned a couple of the lessons learned there, but were there any others that you wanted to sort of share with other projects as they're approaching sellers, either sellers of ecosystem services, either as landowners or land managers?
I think they kind of captured most. I think it's that I do be aware that there is the issue that they'll be often thinking about several strands of work, and early engagement and keep the communications going.
And hopefully, I'm sure we'll have some questions. If not, we'll touch on how you're communicated with those landowners, each of you, because I think that's always really interesting. What was the first communication, and then what sort of media did you use? Brilliant, thanks, Paul. We'll come back to you in just a moment. But Ed, over to you to sort of share with us some of the work of the Environmental Farmers Group.
Hi there, my name's Ed. I'm a scoping group member for the Environmental Farmers Group. We are a farmer cooperative, similar to a grain cooperative model, if anyone's come across that. We're basically an aggregator of land for the purpose of natural capital trading. For farmers, from a farmer's point of view, we provide them with a sort of a safe option where they're sort of working things out, thinking things through, and coming to our members with the best options. There's a lot of stuff, particularly around carbon, which people, particularly farmers, are very wary of at the moment. And we sort of provide that, what we term trusted navigator. And we also have pricing power. We're a co-op, so you can see we're 59,000 hectares, mainly in Hampshire and Wiltshire. We're able to really set a price that is a fair price for farmers. And then from the other side of it, for those looking for natural capital services, we're able to mean that you don't have to deal with a multitude of different farms and landowners. We can deliver projects at scale, aggregated across our membership. We've got really good conservation backing. Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust are on our board. And yeah, we're looking at expanding into other areas of the country as well, which we'll probably go through later. Our aims as a group, as farmers, we believe strongly that we control a large amount of the countryside, and actually we can be the ones that enhance nature. It doesn't have to be all sort of NGOs and large organisations, but to do that we need scale, so that's what we're trying to harness. Our outcomes are biodiversity and species recovery, clean water and net zero carbon farming, which are all aligned with UK government objectives, and we feel as farmers we can deliver that. And then our fourth one is to provide a fair financial return for farmers who deliver this and bring around a lot of this sort of emerging natural capital markets. There are significant sums of money, and we really want to bring that money down into rural communities, onto the farms, and cut out the middleman. That's a little quick overview of what Environmental Farmers Group is.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks. So it's so what I think is really interesting about Environmental Farmers Group is it's farmer-led. It was born out of sort of a farmer cluster in the Hampshire-Wiltshire region where you are, who wanted to do environmental improvements to their land. So obviously it was maybe an easier sell because you already had the sort of sellers of those ecosystem services sort of primed. I guess the first question is, how did you start to work with that farmer cluster group? Or I mean, you're part of the farmer cluster group, aren't you? So it's all come from within.
Yeah, so the story of the Environmental Farmers Group is it's probably 2 years ago. Teresa Dent, the Game Wildlife Conservation Trust, was looking at this area where we've got sort of, I think, 8 or 9 farmer cluster groups, all with boundaries against each other. So we've got a concentration of farmers who are really turned on to nature recovery, doing conservation work on their farms. But actually these clusters are all operating as individual clusters, and we should try and make them work together. And it was through trying to form a super cluster of clusters that we started to realise there was something much bigger here, and that we could keep the cluster groups with their identities and their own independence, but we could build on that network to actually start to form something that was quite interesting in the natural capital area. And then we are all farmers. It's a lot easier for farmers to work with farmers than some other organisations may find it.
Right. And within the farmer clusters that have come together, Environmental Farmers Group, there are different types of farmers, so small and large, and some tenanted, I gather. Can you talk us through, I know you have like an equalisation model when you're working as a co-op to sell ecosystem services, either through nutrient neutrality or and biodiversity net gains, also something you're exploring, as well as soil carbon. Can you talk us through how you have engaged those smaller farmers and encouraged them to take part through this equalisation model of the co-op?
Yeah, so a lot of, particularly with nutrient neutrality and biodiversity net gain, there's a geographical aspect to it. So you might have a farmer who has essentially got lucky because of where their farm is located. You may also have tenant farmers who, although we encourage landlords to work with their tenants, may not be able to enter into longer term schemes. And then we've got quite a few farmers who have actually done a lot of conservation work and have very high baselines already and limited ability to provide an uplift. So the way our model works is that if, for instance, a farmer or a small group of farmers were involved in a large deal, 88% of that money would go to the farmers who delivered the project. 3% we would use for actually running the group for our overheads, and the remaining 9% gets shared on a per hectareage basis amongst all of the members in that river catchment. So it would provide a small income, but as we hope this markets start to emerge and pick up and trades really start to happen, we would hope that actually there could be quite large sums of money being spread around the group through the equalisation model.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned expanding this model out beyond Hampshire and Wiltshire. Obviously, not all farmers are the same. So how is that going? Any lessons learned as you've sort of expanded beyond your current region?
Yeah, so we're not trying to sort of take over as one big organization. It's very important that different areas have their independence. So what we are doing is sort of giving our model to an area. We're trying to work in river catchments because that works quite well. They then form their own board, they work up to an operating group, they get their own members, but they're part of, and importantly, their equalisation stays within their local area. So they are financially independent, but they are overseen by the sort of main organisational board of EFG.
Right. And as I think you and I talked about before, it's the appetite just changes just based on the individual who happens to be farming the land, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. And let's all come back then for Q&A, and we'd love to take your questions from the group. So there are ways you can do that. You can type in the chat. I think I know I can see it because I saw Chris's earlier. You can submit a question on the Q&A. I have that open. I believe you can raise a hand. I don't know if I can see that, so I'll have to rely on other people to tell me if they see it. If you have any questions, because what I find interesting about having all three of our panelists is that very, very different. We've got a farmer-led model working with farmers from the farm up, being sort of the decision makers. In the case of Olivia, it's a national park that's looking for sellers to work with to reach its ambitions for net zero and nature positive. And then Paul, a similar, looking for landowners to work with to support the ambitions of Mersey Forest. And Paul, you'll correct me if I said that. Okay, great. So very different ways of working with sellers, and I think lots to learn. I'm not seeing many questions popping up. That could be me. Shout if you are seeing them. I'm not seeing them, but maybe that's people munching on sandwiches or just pondering because there's a lot of information. So maybe we'll just talk about some of the challenges that we're seeing, or not challenges, around the specific ecosystem services and the markets that are being used. So I don't know if maybe we'll sort of do around the room on biodiversity net gain. Olivia, perhaps coming to you first. How are you seeing biodiversity net gain? Is that kind of where the most interest is? Is it nutrient neutrality? What's your sense?
Biodiversity net gain seems to be the thing that that both private landowners we worked with were most interested in, because it's law. We know there's certainty there. It's not come into force yet, but there's a lot of conversations going on locally about the pipeline for that. They were interested in nitrate neutrality, but the recent development in there's been an amendment proposed to the Levelling Up Bill, which could affect the amount of nitrate offset required. So that has put landowners off a bit, or jumping first, both feet first there. And then Woodland Carbon Code, there was some interest, but it was felt that BNG was a lot easier in the case of our two landowners, private landowners, because one of the reasons was because the habitats would be much easier to create. So they were looking at arable land being converted to wildflower meadow, and they could make money through BNG doing that much easier than having to create a woodland, which would be which have a lot more constraints around it. So that was a consideration for them. Permanent land use change and all of the tax implications of that. That was kind of, they felt there was more to be concerned about with Woodland Carbon Code than BNG.
Right. Thank you. I see a question is from James, but I think we'll just do around the room on this particular topic. So Paul, just coming to you, BNG, nutrient neutrality, woodland carbon, where are you seeing the interest, and what are you seeing?
Like Olivia, so BNG, for us, BNG and woodland carbon, obviously we're kind of, the name Mersey Forest indicates we're interested in trees, so the carbon element is part of what we'd be looking to target, if you like. So those two, and I guess the other thing in terms of being interested in the localness of where that carbon is being bought from, if you like. So they, local buyers.
Thank you. And Ed, you mentioned nutrient neutrality as sort of, is that sort of the leading ecosystem service that your farmers are looking at right now?
Yes, it's we're having a lot of interest from seekers, or we term seekers, people looking for natural capital services in nutrient neutrality. In the Hampshire Avon catchment, there's a phosphate issue, which is locking up a lot of things, and we've already completed a deal, and we've got quite a considerable pipeline of phosphate mitigation projects to come.
Right. So there is a question, they've got two questions coming, one from Tim Youngs on the Q&A section that I invite Olivia and Paul to read while I ask Ed this one. Ed, do you find that generally most farmers are interested in natural capital and new income streams, or do some require more convincing? In which case, what sort of barriers to engagement do you come up against?
I think farmers are interested and excited by delivering natural capital services. I'm not sure that's an issue. I think it's a big scary world out there for a lot of farmers. It's more the issue that might be holding people back. We kind of mitigate that a bit, but then we're also in an area which is very aware of historically farmland conservation. And in other areas of the country, that might be more difficult.
And when you say it's a big scary world out there, in terms of just like uncertainty around elms or price of soil carbon, what is it exactly?
It's not so much uncertainty about elms, it's about being approached by a house builder or a corporate or whatever and selling yourself short, not knowing where to price things, that not really having a clue of the value of what you've got and getting ripped off, or somebody selling maybe a long-term lease or doing some similar sort of deal on a bit of land to deliver a natural capital service, but actually realizing afterwards that it was the middleman, the investor, which really made the money on that.
Right. Which I suppose is where these sort of aggregation models and trusted sort of aggregators in each of you can provide some of that risk mitigation. So there's this question here from Tim Youngs. I don't know if anyone is able to answer this one. Has anyone worked out the strike rate with farmers and land managers to deliver nature-based solutions, i.e. what capital revenue payment rates would farmers require to deliver or host various options, and then see what agri-environment and other measures can already support, and then look at what additionality is needed. Our Nerf Round 2 project, Connecting the Colne, is in a pastoral area on the Devon-Somerset border, so it'd be useful to get some examples from others. Does anyone want to take this one?
Yeah.
Olivia, you're nodding, great.
So we presented a business model to our participating landowners, showing them exactly the revenues. We didn't know what their revenues are from what they currently do, but there were quite a few raised eyebrows in the room. So we got the sense that the opportunities from BNG and nitrates were really attractive. So there wasn't a strike rate as such that would make them say go or hold back. It was more they were assessing what the potential was down the road. It might be good now, but could it be better later? They also had concerns over the sort of tax implications of changing. So however good the rate was, they still had reservations about the tax implications of taking land out of agriculture. And I think the payment rates would probably dictate where they wanted to undertake the environmental improvements on the land. So perhaps if the rates were really good, they would turn over more of their land to nature restoration. And it wasn't, when we were doing the project, it wasn't quite clear what the final rates would be, because we were making assumptions about the availability of buyers. So they weren't quite, it wasn't quite clear what percentage of credits they could sell. So there was no question that their land could generate a huge amount. It was more that, you know, how much could they sell at that stage. So yeah, we haven't quite got to the bottom, but that's an ongoing question for us, what that strike rate looks like in our local area.
Thank you, Olivia. Paul, what about you? It's a slightly different situation because, you know, land is being sold in some instances. So what are you seeing?
Yeah, so the what we've looked at is particularly with carbon, you know, what the strike rates might need to be in order to make a difference to landowners, to make the numbers stack up. So in our models, just looking at, you know, what does it need to be, how far above where we are now, and is there any way of enhancing the offer locally to get to that rate?
Are you able to sort of share, you know, is it significantly higher than prices that we're seeing at the moment is needed?
It's significantly above the carbon guarantee rate, but we are seeing, yeah, people not batting, well, some organisations not batting an eyelid when that number is mentioned. So there are potential buyers out there at those rates.
Right, thank you. Ed, what about yourself? What are you seeing? And I know that you've sort of said that you initially weren't going to look at soil carbon, but actually it's going. So you started looking at what are your thoughts on this one?
Soil carbon, we've found quite difficult to settle on a model that we would be comfortable to go to our members with and say, look, guys, you could trade to this. We are working on it. We've spoken to probably every soil carbon trading company or company with a model that you've heard of, and some you haven't. And we're getting there. It's something we do have to offer because it is going to be a significant source of income into agriculture. Whether that is done through maybe a credit that supports sustainable farming and has other stuff banded onto it as well as just being pure soil carbon, or whether we do settle on a soil carbon model that we're comfortable with, we're not sure yet. And
in terms of strike rates for any other things that you're looking at, is there?
So we perhaps are looking at this from the opposite end. If an organisation or a house builder, for instance, is needing to have some credits to unlock their house building project, we look at it as what are those credits worth to the house builder, rather than what's the lowest the farmer would deliver it for. Right.
Brilliant, thank you. A couple of other questions here. Has anyone got ideas on stacking or bundling for BNG and nutrient neutrality within a mandatory planning system? Can a habitat be sold twice? Oh, these are the big questions we want to know. But it'd be interesting to sort of understand how each of you are approaching this challenge of stacking and bundling, given we don't have clarity at the moment. Who would like? Anyone want to volunteer?
Yeah, happy to.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia.
So in the business model put forward under the project, the BNG and nutrient neutrality were treated separately. So because it wasn't clear whether what the conditions would be. So and that's still an evolving question. I've been speaking to our planning team about how they would treat that, and there's still lots of questions about how you demonstrate that additionality. So yeah, very much a live question in the New Forest.
Anyone else solved it yet? No.
No. We strongly believe that stacking can be possible, but it's going to be tricky. But perhaps your second or third environmental goods are not worth what they would be on a project purely by themselves. But yeah, it's a tricky one around additionality, but we think there's a way it can be done.
Thank you. Then Holly Barkley shares, missed part of the webinar, so apologies, this was answered already, I don't think so, but I'm interested in the timescale required from buyers, biodiversity or nutrient credits more than 30 years versus the timescale that farmers are willing to commit to. I imagine that these long-term land agreements can be off-putting to sellers. great question. How are each of you tackling sort of the long-term issues or the long-term nature of contracts around some of these ecosystems service markets? Ed?
I don't think it's necessarily a problem. It could be a problem for tenant farmers where they might not have the flexibility to do that. But having said that, 2 of our board members are tenant farmers, and we're in agreements with their landlord and the farmer themselves. Farmers take a long view. Most farmers are multi-generational businesses. You farming partially with an eye on what the next generation is going to do. And as such, it's not unheard of to do sort of decade-long deals. Any farmer who's put a solar installation on their farm is probably in a 20, 30, 40-year deal on that piece of land. And that the answer is it comes down to value. If the natural capital services values are anywhere near the value of land for solar, then it would be very possible for farmers to enter into longer term agreements.
It's probably the thing. I mean, the farmer collectives that you're working with are probably quite different in appetite for those, maybe in a different part of the country. I know your set of farmers are quite commercial and large in their orientation, but just out of interest, are you seeing a difference elsewhere as you're sort of exploring different?
We're not the most commercial bunch of farmers, and we do have some very, very small farmers in the Hampshire Avon catchment. So we are a broad church. As we're going into some other catchments, we're actually finding them much more commercial, and therefore open to these sorts of things. But yeah, there is something there for everyone. And as we sort of speak to various different groups and co-ops around the country who are interested in our model and how it could work in their area, we're sort of getting little snapshots of the sort of differences. But yeah, it can work for everyone.
All right, great. Olivia or Paul, you want to share anything about the sort of long-term nature of some of these contracts and whether that's a bit off-putting?
Yeah, I think for what we saw was BNG for 30 years wasn't such an issue. There were some reservations expressed about entering into nutrient contracts, which are minimum 80, and then that having, that needed much more careful consideration, given it would have implications for the next generation. That's what we were seeing.
Are you, Paul?
So, yeah, I think it's the extent of our work with landowners is that they will commit to long-term contracts with us for some of our work. So that has happened already. We've not really done the models with nitrogen or nitrogen rather, so just experience on that.
And is there anything to be said for just the type of organisations that you come sort of rubber stamped as trustworthy organisation, like with a track record? Especially, I'm just thinking sort of Olivia and Paul particularly have been going some time. Olivia has been around a while at the national park, I think. So I just wondered if that you feel like the conversations slightly differ than maybe some of the other opportunities that these landowners or land managers are being presented with.
I'd say for us, we've been around about 30 years, so know lots of the landowners. We're probably going back to work with several times, and often our work is by word of mouth, so neighbours and friends who come to us to work with us.
Yeah, I mean, the national park has been around since 2005, so it's had a chance to establish some good working relationships with its landowners, which meant it was there was a good foundation for engagement on this NERF project. We were acting as a facilitator in terms of like how can we help our local stakeholders understand the opportunities to them, and so we weren't deriving an income from this. So in the sense of trust, yes, it was about having good relationships really at this stage. And it's a question for us is what part do we play in the market going forward? I think what we found from this project was that the markets might not always deliver the ecologically optimum outcome. So, as a national park with aims on nature recovery, what role can we play to sort of help ensure that the markets deliver that ecological optimum?
Right, thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I do encourage people listening, please do submit your questions or raise your hand if you've got them while we've got our panel here, and we will be writing up some of the answers as well and feeding them back into the toolkit. But I guess, maybe we'll do just sort of ask each of you, what do you see some of the challenges around these markets, particularly in light of working with sellers, or what are some of the unusual lessons you've learned, even down to the minutiae of, oh, it turns out that we should be doing meetings in the morning if we want to engage people rather than the evening because no one turns up. Even down to that kind of minutiae, I always think that's sort of helpful if you're putting together a project, these things you don't think about. So I don't know if anyone, and we can sort of keep going round and round as you think of them, but has anyone got a couple in mind they want to share? Put you on the spot.
I think for our project, it was helpful that we went in with a strong proposition, and we're very clear about how we wanted our stakeholders to engage with us. To take the example of the two private landowners, they're running a commercial enterprise and they don't have all day to sit around and chat. So there we were able to engage with them and say, we want to develop this business model and this will help you work out what nature recovery will do compared to what you currently do. And that was a very attractive proposition to them. It also gave the project a chance to test some of the assumptions in the business model in terms of the restoration costs. Were they accurate for the local area? And to gave a chance to kind of create a business model that was truly reflective of the sort of current costs, rather than having something that was more broad brush, rough estimate. Right,
that's really helpful. Thank you. Paul.
Yeah, I think for us, one of the examples was where the natural capital enhancement was actually part of a much bigger development program for the farm. So the owner definitely saw this as being something that probably enhanced and enabled what they wanted to do in the rest of the estate.
And how did you know that going in, or did you know that going in? No, you didn't.
It's kind of discussions over that. This provides some benefit for the things we want to do in the next few years.
Yeah, but Paul, where you are, do you work with farmer clusters? I'm just interested in whether that's like a routine that you've explored.
I'm really jealous of what Ed's got, so having something like that would be perfect.
There you go, Ed. That's your next replication of your model. And what about you, Ed? Sort of just if you could dispense your pearls of wisdom for those listening on what you've learned.
For farmers, it's absolutely about trust. I think that's where we've been able to do quite well in relatively short time in getting our farmers together is because we are a board running this who are farmers in this area, and absolutely trust is a key thing. As I said earlier, it is quite a scary thing to enter into a market you know nothing about and don't understand what the value should be, and lots of people are telling you different things. And actually, I think for them to have someone who can guide them through it and take some of that flack for them. And then in terms of top tips, if you want to get farmers to a meeting, do it at breakfast time and give them free bacon sandwiches.
So not vegan tarts at lunchtime. That's not going to go down well. Very good. Thank you. Well, this has been really great. Thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions. So a quiet audience today, but thank you to David, Holly, Tim and James, for your questions, much appreciated, and thanks for sort of stimulating that conversation. We are going to, this is recorded, so we will be sharing the recording within the toolkit so that you can access some of these learnings, and as I've said, you'll see some of the case studies from our panelists and their projects starting to go up in the next few weeks, hopefully. So you can sort of see some of those learnings out there, and we'll be building some of the sharings today back into the toolkit. So I think that just leaves it for us to say, yeah, thank you very much to all those who've attended for being interested. We are going to be having another session on baselining. If there are specific questions that you would like answered on that particular Milestone 3 session, you can just drop me an email. Otherwise, you can email my colleague phoebe.tucker@gfi.green if you want any feedback into the toolkit yourself, or if you have questions about the toolkit, please do that. But otherwise, thank you so much, Olivia, Paul and Ed, for sharing about your projects today. I'm looking forward to sort of hearing more about them as they go on. So thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks.